In October 2022, an experienced hiker set out to cross a remote section of the Karpat Mountains. He had prepared carefully. The weather was stable. The route was mapped. But within 24 hours, he disappeared without a trace. When rescuers finally located him 6 days later, he was alone, dehydrated, and unable to fully explain what had happened. This is the story he told them. They say you never really hear the mountain. You just feel it. A heaviness in the chest, a tightening behind your ribs, like it's testing whether you belong there, whether you're worth the air you're taking up. I used to think that was a romantic exaggeration, a thing hikers said to make themselves brave. Until last October, when I learned the truth firsthand. It started like any other solo hike. I'd been planning it for months, the Karpat Ridge Crossing, an old trail that cut across the Romanian borderlands and wound through a series of limestone cliffs and dense pine forests. It was supposed to be 3 days, 42 miles. Difficult, but nothing beyond my experience. I'd done harder treks in the Alps, in the Rockies. I wasn't afraid of snow or isolation. I liked the feeling. The quiet, the sense of being stripped of everything unnecessary. Out here, there were no expectations, no deadlines, no one asking why I hadn't answered their messages. Just me and the mountain. That morning, the air had a bite to it. Autumn was tipping into early winter. Frost clung to the pine needles in fine crystals that caught the light like tiny mirrors. My breath made slow clouds that drifted behind me as I climbed. The trail was clear if narrow, little orange markers nailed into the trees every 100 yards or so. I checked my GPS every hour, not because I needed to, but because I liked knowing exactly where I was. That was the first mistake. Overconfidence. The second was thinking those markers would always be there. By noon, the sky had changed. A gray film settled over the ridgeline, dissolving the sharp edges of the cliffs into something softer, less certain. I stopped to eat, sitting on a flat rock that overlooked a steep valley choked with pines. The wind carried the faint smell of wood smoke, though I hadn't seen any camps or cabins. I remember feeling a flicker of unease, like I wasn't alone. But I shook it off. Mountains play tricks on you if you let them. I packed up, checked my coordinates, and pressed on. An hour later, the markers were gone. I must have missed one, I told myself. I must have strayed off the main trail without realizing. I turned back the way I'd come, expecting to see the last orange strip nailed to a trunk. Nothing. The GPS showed my position exactly where I thought it would be, a narrow switchback on the north face.
But when I turned in a full circle, the terrain didn't match. The trees were too dense, the slope too steep. It felt like the forest had shifted in my absence. My heart started to pound in that dull, heavy way that doesn't feel like fear, just inevitability. I took a breath. I'd get my bearings. I'd retrace my steps. That's when I noticed something in the snow near my boot. A print. Not mine. Too narrow. Too long. Human. Barefoot. I stared at it longer than I should have, waiting for some part of my mind to offer an explanation. A prank? An animal. But the shape was unmistakable. 5 toes, an arch, the curve of a heel. Frozen perfectly into the crust of snow. No other prints around it. Just that single impression. And that was when it hit me. The mountain didn't need to roar to make itself known. It could whisper. I didn't know yet that I was already off the trail. I didn't know yet that this was the last time I'd see a marker. All I knew was that the air felt heavier than it should have, and my breath was starting to come too fast.
I don't remember exactly when the certainty drained away. One moment I was telling myself it was a simple navigation error. The next, I was standing in a ring of pines that all looked identical, turning in slow circles, feeling my pulse crawl up into my throat. The barefoot print was still there behind me, perfectly preserved. I tried to convince myself it meant nothing. Maybe someone had come through without shoes, as unlikely as that sounded. Maybe a group I'd never seen had passed this way and I'd simply missed them. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't explain the single print, or why it was so perfectly centered in the middle of the trail. I forced myself to look away, focus on the tangible. I pulled the GPS out of my chest pocket again and toggled the screen. Same coordinates, same spot I'd been an hour before. But when I looked up, the trees didn't match the contour lines on the map. The slope was wrong. The density of the trunks was wrong. It felt like I'd stepped sideways into a duplicate landscape. My breath came faster. The cold air burned in my lungs. I'd been in tight spots before. Sudden weather shifts, sprained ankles miles from help. But this felt different. This felt like the mountain itself had turned against me. I picked a direction, downhill, and started moving. The logic was simple. Find the valley floor, follow the watercourse. Eventually, I'd intersect another trail or see a landmark I recognized. The GPS would reorient once I was out of the trees. I told myself these things because I needed to believe them. I don't know how long I walked. My legs began to ache from the slope. My toes were numb inside my boots. The trees never thinned. The light never changed. It was still that gray, directionless gloom. After a while, I realized I hadn't checked the time. I pulled back my sleeve to look at my watch. 3:41 p.m. I'd started walking at noon, but the sun hadn't moved. I swallowed hard, fighting the rise of panic. Focus. I stopped to take stock of my supplies. 2 liters of water, 3 energy bars, a small first aid kit, emergency blanket, fire starter. Enough to last a night, maybe 2. My fingers shook as I zipped the pack shut. Something moved behind me. I turned so fast I nearly lost my balance. The trees stood silent, unmoving, but I felt it. The certainty of not being alone, the pressure of unseen eyes. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Silence. But it wasn't empty silence. It was charged, expectant. I forced myself to keep going, one foot in front of the other. My boots crunched over patches of old snow and dead needles. My breathing grew ragged. 100 yards later, I saw it. Another footprint. This one pressed into a patch of dark moss between 2 roots. Barefoot again. Same size, same perfect detail. I backed away without thinking. My shoulder hit a tree trunk, sending flakes of old bark to the ground. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I turned and ran. I didn't plan it. Instinct took over. Just get away from that print, that impossible impression in the moss. My pack bounced against my spine with every stride. My breath tore out in ragged gasps. I don't know how long I ran. 5 minutes? An hour? Long enough for my vision to tunnel at the edges. When I finally stopped, doubled over and wheezing, I looked around and my stomach dropped. Another footprint. No trail, no boot prints, just that same bare foot pressed into the snow ahead of me as though it had been waiting. The realization settled in cold and final. I wasn't just lost. I was being followed. I stood there for a long time, staring at the print in the snow. The longer I looked, the more impossible it seemed. Perfectly shaped, no signs of melting or distortion, just there. I forced myself to look away. Fixating wouldn't help. I needed to think. My pulse hammered in my ears as I unpacked the steps. Find shelter, start a fire, conserve energy. Panic was the real predator. If I let it take root, it would finish me long before cold or hunger did. I turned slowly, scanning the slope. About 20 yards uphill, a small rocky overhang jutted from the side of the ridge. If the weather turned, it would at least keep the snow off me. I started toward it, forcing each step to be deliberate. My body felt distant, uncooperative, like I was walking underwater. When I reached the overhang, I dropped my pack and crouched to check the ground. Dry enough.
The air smelt faintly of old pine resin. It reminded me of a cabin I'd stayed in as a kid, safe, warm. That memory hurt in a way I didn't expect. I spread out the emergency blanket and arranged a small pile of kindling I'd collected along the way. My hand shook so badly it took 3 tries to get the fire started to catch. When the first spark took, relief flooded through me so suddenly I almost laughed. The flame grew, licking at the dry twigs, crackling in the hush. It felt obscene to make noise in this place, like I was announcing myself to something that had been perfectly content to watch in silence. As the fire built, I risked a glance at my watch again. 3:41 p.m. Same as before. I swallowed hard. The light hadn't shifted either. The sky was still that flat, featureless gray. I looked back at the trees and felt the same pressure, the same sense that I was being observed. I tried to shake it off. I needed calories. I forced down half an energy bar, though it tasted like sawdust in my dry mouth. I drank sparingly from my water bottle, mindful of how quickly supplies could run out. The fire helped. The heat seeped into my legs, thawing the numb ache in my muscles. For a little while, I could almost pretend I wasn't hopelessly lost in a place that felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Night fell without warning. One moment, the trees were washed in dim gray light. The next, darkness had pooled between them, thick and complete. My fire was the only boundary between visibility and pitch black. I added another stick, listening to the soft pop of sap. The sound was almost comforting. Almost. I tried not to look beyond the fire's edge, but I couldn't help it. Every few minutes I'd glance up, half expecting to see something moving just beyond the reach of the light. Nothing ever did. But the feeling never left, that sense that the darkness itself was leaning in. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and told myself I'd be found, that someone would realize I hadn't checked in and raise the alarm, that a search team would come. But even as I thought it, doubt crept in. The trail was remote, the weather unpredictable. If the GPS continued to fail, they wouldn't even know where to look. I set my jaw and stared into the fire until my eyes watered. Sleep came in fits, shallow and anxious. Every time I drifted off, I dreamed of the footprints, dozens of them, circling my little camp in perfect, silent rings. When I woke to the real world again, the fire was low. My breath steamed in the frigid air. The trees stood as they had before, patient, motionless, as if they'd never moved at all. I closed my eyes and waited for dawn, though I was no longer sure dawn would come. I don't know how long I sat by that dying fire, eyes closed, refusing to look into the darkness.
Long enough for my thoughts to start looping, repeating the same questions in a dull chant. How far had I come off the trail? Why hadn't I seen anyone else? And why, of all things, was there a barefoot print in the snow? At some point, I must have drifted again into that shallow, uneasy sleep, because when I opened my eyes, the fire was nothing but a smoldering line of embers. My breath came out in white clouds, and my fingers were stiff from the cold. I fumbled for the flashlight clipped to my pack. When I turned it on, the beam stabbed through the dark, catching on the rough rock ceiling and the trunks beyond. I swept it slowly around the perimeter, reassuring myself that nothing had changed, except something had. Just beyond the fire pit, about 5 feet from where I'd been sleeping, was a single line of small stones. 5 of them, arranged in a perfect arc. I stared, unblinking, pulse thudding in my ears. I hadn't put them there. I would have remembered. And even if I'd been sleepwalking, an idea that made my skin prickle, where had the stones come from? The overhang floor had been clear when I settled in. I leaned closer. Each stone was about the size of a walnut, pale against the dark earth. They looked almost deliberately chosen, as if someone had taken the time to sort them. The flashlight shook in my grip. My first thought was to scatter them, to break the pattern, but some instinct stopped me, as if disrupting them would cross a line I didn't understand. I forced myself to look away. My mouth had gone dry. The taste of fear was bitter, metallic. I stood slowly, legs unsteady, and stepped to the edge of the overhang. The trees loomed, still and inscrutable. I swept the beam between their trunks, searching for any movement. Nothing. But that didn't comfort me. If anything, the absence of evidence felt worse, like whatever had arranged the stones was clever enough not to be seen. I backed into the shelter and sat again, never taking my eyes off that little arc of rocks. I tried to come up with an explanation. Animals, gravity, some unconscious action of my own. None of it made sense. Hours passed, or minutes. Time was untrustworthy here. Eventually, the darkness softened, turning from black to charcoal to the ashen gray of dawn. My watch still said 3:41. I didn't look at it again. When there was enough light to see without the flashlight, I packed up mechanically. I left the stones untouched. Even the thought of moving them made my stomach lurch. I told myself the same lie I'd been repeating since I realized I was lost. Keep moving. It can't follow you if you keep moving. Started downhill again, hoping I'd eventually cross a trail or a stream. My legs felt heavier with each step, as if the forest were wrapping itself around me, adding invisible weight.
I didn't stop to rest. I didn't eat. Every time I paused, I thought I heard something behind me, a soft rustle, a sigh of breath that wasn't mine. Once, when I turned too quickly, I caught a glimpse of something between the trees, a pale shape, a suggestion of movement. Gone before my eyes could focus. I told myself it was a trick of the light. I told myself I was exhausted, dehydrated, imagining things. But in the secret part of my mind, the part I couldn't soothe with rational thought, I knew better. The forest wasn't indifferent. It wasn't passive. It was watching. And it wanted me to know that it was watching. As I stumbled through the thinning snow, I realized a deeper truth that made my hands tremble. I could leave as many footprints as I wanted, but the only ones I'd find would never be my own. By the time the light had settled into a dull, colorless day, I'd been walking for what felt like hours. My legs were raw with fatigue. My thoughts drifted in and out of focus, skipping like a scratched record. I kept waiting for something familiar, a ridgeline, a split in the slope, any marker to prove I hadn't wandered into some closed loop. But every clearing looked like the last. Every copse of pines had the same hushed expectancy. If there were trails here, they'd been erased. It was late morning, or what passed for it, when I heard the sound, a low hum, too steady to be wind. I stopped, breath hitching, and turned my head, trying to pinpoint the direction. It came from somewhere uphill, muffled by trees and distance. At first, I thought it might be a rescue team, an engine, a generator. Hope flared so bright it almost hurt. I forced my aching legs to climb toward it, scrambling over slick roots and rocks. As I moved, the sound grew clearer. Not an engine, not any machine I could recognize. It was a resonance, a vibration I felt in my ribs as much as in my ears. My skin prickled, and I had the sudden, irrational certainty that if I turned around, I'd see something standing at the tree line. I didn't turn. The humming intensified until it was all I could hear. My vision blurred at the edges. Each step felt like pushing through invisible resistance. My breath came ragged and shallow. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the sound stopped. Silence crashed over me, so complete it felt like a blow. My ears rang in the aftermath. I stood there swaying, waiting for something, movement, a voice, anything to explain what had just happened. Nothing came. I forced myself forward again, half expecting the humming to resume with the next step, but the forest remained quiet, watching. I don't know how long I climbed before I reached the clearing. It wasn't large, maybe 20 feet across, but it felt deliberate, like the trees had chosen to stop growing there. In the center was a circle of stones, perfectly arranged. Each one was pale, smooth and wet-looking, as if they'd just been pulled from a river. I swallowed, throat dry. My pulse skittered. I should have turned back. I should have ignored it, pretend that I hadn't seen. But some compulsion, curiosity, exhaustion, something darker, drew me closer. The stones weren't random. Up close, I could see faint markings carved into their surfaces, not letters, symbols, spirals, intersecting lines, shapes that made my eyes ache when I tried to trace them. I crouched, reaching out without fully realizing I was moving. The moment my fingers touched the nearest stone, a cold so deep it felt ancient rushed up my arm, locking my breath in my chest. My vision tunneled, black creeping in from the edges. And in that darkness, I felt it. Not a presence, not exactly, more like an attention, something vast and patient, brushing against my thoughts. I tried to pull back, but my hand wouldn't move. My heart hammered so violently I thought it would burst. Images flickered behind my eyes, dark corridors lined with trees, footprints in snow that never melted, a figure standing with its face turned away. I don't know how long I knelt there, locked in that silent exchange. When I finally tore my hand free, I fell back onto the cold ground, gasping. My fingers were numb. My skin felt wrong, too tight, as if it barely contained whatever was underneath. I forced myself to stand. My legs trembled. The clearing was unchanged. The stones lay quiet, unthreatening, as though nothing had happened. But something had. I could feel it in the way the air pressed against my skin, in the way the trees seemed to lean in just a fraction closer. Whatever line I'd been skirting since the moment I lost the trail, I'd crossed it, and there was no pretending otherwise. I stumbled out of the clearing, not looking back. Some part of me knew it was watching, that it would keep watching, no matter how far I ran. For the first time, the thought of not making it out didn't feel like a possibility. It felt like a promise. I don't remember leaving the clearing. One moment I was on my knees, fighting to pull breath into lungs that didn't feel like mine. The next I was moving downhill again, stumbling over rocks and roots, my vision shimmering at the edges like heat rising from asphalt. I must have walked for hours. My thoughts were fragments, looping images of the stones, the symbols I couldn't read, the figure I hadn't dared to face. Every so often, I'd catch myself whispering under my breath, though I didn't know the words. When the trees began to thin,
It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing.
Light, real, unfiltered daylight spilled across the ground ahead of me. For the first time in what felt like days, I saw the shape of shadows, the subtle shifts of clouds overhead. My steps slowed. Part of me expected the illusion to dissolve the moment I reached it, for the forest to close in again. But when I passed between the last two pines, nothing happened. No humming, no invisible pressure, just open sky. I stood there, blinking, unsure whether to feel relief or dread. Below the ridge, the valley spread out in ragged lines of trees and meadows. Far off, a thin silver ribbon cut across the landscape. A road. Civilization. My breath caught in my throat. My legs almost buckled. The sight of it, so ordinary, so unremarkable, was more surreal than anything I'd seen in that clearing. I nearly laughed. Instead, I felt something warm spill down my cheek. I wiped it away without thinking. Tears. I started down the slope. Each step felt heavier, as though some part of me had been left behind in the trees, and the rest of me was dragging its absence like a broken limb. Halfway down, I heard the sound, a distant mechanical drone, steady, familiar. I looked up to see a helicopter cresting the ridge, moving in slow arcs as it scanned the treetops. My heart stuttered. Rescue. I reached for the flare clipped to my packstrap. My hands fumbled with the latch, clumsy from cold and exhaustion. When I finally wrenched it free, I popped the cap and raised it high. The flare spat a blossom of red smoke into the air. The helicopter shifted course, angling toward me. For a moment I stood there, arm aloft, watching that machine draw closer. I thought I would feel triumphant, saved. Instead, all I felt was hollow. The trees behind me stood silent, their shadows long and patient. As the helicopter settled onto the meadow below, I took one last look over my shoulder. The forest waited. It wasn't triumphant. It didn't care that I'd left, because it knew some part of me would always remain there, caught in that cold moment of contact. I turned away. Rescue workers poured out, waving me forward. I moved toward them, each step heavier than the last. When they reached me, their faces blurred in the sunlight. Hands grabbed my arms, steadying me, guiding me toward the waiting stretcher. They were speaking, questions, instructions, but I couldn't make sense of any of it. One of them asked my name. It took me too long to remember. My voice cracked. I'm here. It was the only truth I could manage. As they lifted me into the helicopter, I closed my eyes. The roar of the rotors swallowed everything. My last thought, before the world tilted into darkness, was that the mountain had never needed to keep me. It had only needed me to know I'd never really left.